"You don't belong in this room. Go find the service entrance." That's what Jeffrey Crane said to Elwood Massamba on the morning of the Harrington Group's annual leadership summit, in front of 47 people, in the lobby of the Fairmont Royal York in Toronto. Elwood Massamba didn't raise his voice. He didn't move. He looked at Jeffrey Crane the way a man looks at something he's already decided how to handle. What Jeffrey Crane didn't know was that the man he'd just spoken to owned 14% of the Harrington Group's parent company, and had for the past 6 years. Let me take you back to the beginning. The Harrington Group occupied the top 3 floors of a glass tower on Bay Street, the kind of building where the elevator required a key card after 5 p.m., and the boardrooms had names instead of numbers: Meridian, Apex, Cornerstone. The carpets were thick enough to muffle ambition. The coffee machines cost more than some people's cars. The firm managed private equity across 4 provinces and had a client list that read like a who's who of old Canadian money, families who'd been wealthy long enough that they no longer talked about it. The summit happened every October. 3 days of presentations, dinners, and handshakes that decided which direction the firm would move for the next fiscal year. Partners flew in from Vancouver and Montreal. Senior analysts brought their best numbers. The hotel ballroom was booked 11 months in advance. Elwood Massamba had attended 7 of these summits, not as a guest, not as a hire, as a shareholder. He was 53 years old, born in Kinshasa, raised in Longueuil, Quebec, by a mother who cleaned offices and a father who drove transit until his knees gave out. He'd put himself through Concordia on a combination of scholarships, part-time work, and the specific kind of focus that only comes from having no margin for error. He got his CFA designation at 29, joined a small asset management firm in Ottawa at 31. By 40, he'd built Massamba Capital from a 2-person operation above a Lebanese restaurant on Elgin Street into a mid-sized fund managing close to $800 million in assets. He did not drive a flashy car. He wore the same style of wool overcoat every winter, dark charcoal, no logo. His watch was a Seiko that his father had given him the day he graduated. He kept his hair short and his suits quiet. Not because he was modest, but because he'd learned early that certain rooms had a way of only seeing the surface of a black man. And he'd decided a long time ago that the surface would give them nothing to grab onto. His investment in the Harrington Group's parent company, Crestfield Holdings, had been structured through a numbered corporation for tax purposes. He'd never announced it publicly. He'd never needed to. The quarterly reports came to his office. The dividends cleared automatically. He sat on no active committees, made no demands, attended no calls unless he chose to. He chose to attend the summit this year because Crestfield's board had proposed a strategic pivot that Elwood Massamba believed was a mistake. He wanted to see the people making the argument before he decided what to do about it. He arrived at the Fairmont at 8:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. He wore his charcoal overcoat. He carried a single leather portfolio. His driver dropped him at the main entrance on Front Street. Jeffrey Crane was standing near the check-in desk when Elwood Massamba walked through the doors. Jeffrey Crane was 51, the kind of man who'd been handsome in his 30s and had confused that with being impressive in his 50s. He was Harrington's Director of Strategic Partnerships, a title that sounded like it meant everything and functioned like it meant very little. He'd inherited his first connection to the firm through his father-in-law's golf club membership. He wore his conference lanyard before the conference had even started. The way people do when the lanyard is the most important thing they'll put on that day. He looked at Elwood Massamba coming through the lobby. Overcoat, leather portfolio, no lanyard, black, excuse me. Crane's voice carried across the marble floor. Several people turned. "You don't belong in this room. Go find the service entrance." The lobby went quiet, the way lobbies go quiet when something has happened that everyone knows is wrong, but nobody is sure who is going to address it. Elwood Massamba stopped walking. He didn't turn immediately. He stood still for 1 breath, 2, the way a man stands still when he's deciding not to do what his first instinct told him. Then he turned around. He looked at Jeffrey Crane directly, not with anger, with assessment, the way an investor looks at a position he's already figured out. He said nothing. He walked to the check-in desk, gave his name to the woman behind it. Janelle, her badge said, who recognized the name immediately and whose expression shifted with visible professionalism, and received his materials. The lanyard he placed into his portfolio without putting it on. Then he walked toward the elevator. Several people in the lobby were still watching. Jeffrey Crane had turned back to his conversation, satisfied with himself in the particular way of a man who believes his assumptions have never once been wrong. He was about to spend 3 days in the same building as the man he'd just directed to the service entrance, and he had no idea. Elwood Massamba's first full day at the summit started with a panel on alternative investments. He sat in the 4th row. He didn't introduce himself. He took notes in his portfolio with a pen that had run dry 3 times and been refilled because he didn't see any reason to replace it. He watched the presenters, listened to the arguments, and wrote down 3 things he disagreed with and 1 thing he thought was genuinely smart. At the car break, a woman named Ingrid Haugen introduced herself. She was a portfolio strategist from the Vancouver office, mid-40s, direct in the way that people from the West Coast often are, when they've been working in finance long enough to stop performing. She'd looked up the attendee list that morning and recognized Elwood Massamba's name from a case study she'd read during her own CFA prep 2 decades ago. Massamba Capital, she said. The Rideau restructure, he smiled. Long time ago. Still taught, she said. I told 2 analysts to read it last month. They had coffee. He asked about the Vancouver portfolio. She told him. She didn't ask why he was there or what his relationship to Harrington was. She treated him the way professionals treat each other when neither one has anything to prove. At the lunch table, Jeffrey Crane sat 2 seats down. He did not recognize Elwood Massamba. Why would he? He'd already categorized him that morning and moved on. Crane talked loudly through most of the meal about the Pacific Northwest real estate corridor and his view that the firm needed to be moving harder into pre-construction. He used the word aggressive 14 times. Elwood Massamba counted, not maliciously. It was a habit. That afternoon, the session turned to Crestfield's proposed pivot, shifting a significant portion of the fund's exposure from diversified Canadian equities into a concentrated bet on energy transition infrastructure. The lead presenter was a man named Roland Ashby, Harrington's chief investment officer, who had a confident delivery and a slide deck that made the numbers look better than they were. Elwood Massamba watched the presentation and wrote 4 pages of notes. The strategy had problems. He could see 3 of them clearly from the 4th row without access to the full model. The concentration risk was underweighted. The regulatory timeline assumptions were optimistic by at least 18 months based on what he knew about federal environmental approvals. And the exit scenario depended on a secondary market that didn't exist yet and might not for a decade. He said nothing during the session. He asked no questions. He wrote down his analysis, closed his portfolio, and went up to his room at 5 p.m. He called his lawyer, a woman named Claudine Bertrand in Ottawa, who had worked with him for 11 years and whose voice always sounded like she'd been expecting the call. The pivot's a problem, he said. How big? Enough. I want to be in the room when the board votes. Claudine was quiet for a moment. You've never activated the shareholder participation clause. I know. Crestfield's legal team will have 2 weeks' notice to prepare. If we file tomorrow, Elwood Massamba said. He hung up. He sat at the desk by the window and looked out at the lake. November had turned the water the color of old pewter. A ferry moved slowly across toward the islands. He didn't order room service. He ate at a small Vietnamese restaurant on King Street, alone, and was back in his room by 8. The next morning, the 2nd day of the summit, Jeffrey Crane arrived at the breakfast session and found Elwood Massamba already seated at one of the round tables with Roland Ashby and 2 members of the Harrington executive team. Crane didn't understand what he was seeing at first. He watched Ashby leaning forward, nodding, the body language of a man listening to someone he's taking seriously. He watched the 2 executives doing the same. He got his coffee, came back, and caught the edge of the conversation. The regulatory assumption is where I'd push back hardest, Elwood Massamba was saying quietly, without performance. The NEB timeline on similar projects has averaged 22 months longer than projections over the past 7 years. That's not a rounding error. That's a structural risk your model hasn't priced. Roland Ashby said, We've built in a buffer of 8 months. I saw the slide. A pause. Who exactly are you with? Ashby asked. Elwood Massamba looked at him evenly. Massamba Capital. We hold 14% of Crestfield Holdings through a numbered corporation. I filed shareholder participation notice this morning. Claudine Bertrand is your legal team's point of contact. The table went still. Jeffrey Crane, standing 6 feet away with his coffee, heard every word. It would be satisfying to describe what happened on his face as shame. It wasn't quite shame. It was the specific collapse of a man's certainty about the structure of the world. The moment when the categories he'd used his entire life to make sense of people showed themselves to be wrong, and the wrongness was public, and there was nothing he could do about it. He set his coffee down. He walked back to the buffet. He didn't go back to that table. The rest of that morning moved quickly. News of the filed notice spread through the executive floors the way news spreads in institutions where information is power. Quietly, through text messages and whispered hallway conversations. By 10 a.m., the summit's breakout sessions had rearranged themselves around the new reality. A shareholder with 14% making a formal intervention on a proposed strategic pivot wasn't a disruption. It was an event. Roland Ashby requested a private meeting for that afternoon. Elwood Massamba agreed to an hour. They met in one of the named boardrooms, Meridian, with two of Harrington's senior partners and Crestfield's in-house counsel on a video call from Calgary. Elwood Massamba brought his 4 pages of notes and a 1-page summary that Claudine had formatted that morning. He didn't lecture. He didn't perform. He walked through his concerns the same way he'd walked through 100 investment reviews over 25 years. Specifically, with evidence, without ego. The regulatory timeline issue was the most serious. He had 3 comparable federal approval processes he'd tracked personally, with dates and outcomes. The secondary market assumption was the second issue. He explained what a realistic 5-year development curve looked like for that infrastructure class and why the model's exit scenario required conditions that weren't going to exist on the proposed timeline. The third issue was concentration risk. He didn't need to explain it at length. When he put the relevant numbers on the table, Crestfield's in-house counsel interrupted him mid-sentence to ask the Calgary team to pull the original model. The meeting went 90 minutes. When it ended, Roland Ashby sat back in his chair and looked at Elwood Massamba the way people look when they've been shown something they didn't want to see but can't argue with. "We'll need to revise the proposal," Ashby said. "I know," Elwood Massamba said. He didn't say anything else. He closed his portfolio, thanked the room, and walked out. In the hallway, a young black analyst named Darius Ofosu, 26, from Scarborough, 8 months into his first position at Harrington, had been waiting with a set of revised slides that Ashby had asked for before the meeting. He'd overheard the last part of the exchange through the boardroom door without meaning to. He looked at Elwood Massamba in the hallway with an expression that was trying to be professional and not quite managing it. Elwood Massamba looked back at him. He noticed the slides in the young man's hands. He noticed the Harrington badge, the careful suit, the particular alertness of a person who is always watching because they know they are always being watched. "How long have you been here?" Elwood Massamba asked. 8 months, Darius Ofosu said. "How's the work?" "Good. Hard. Good." Elwood Massamba nodded. He reached into his portfolio and pulled out a business card. Plain white, just his name and a number. He handed it to Darius Ofosu. "Call if you ever want to talk about the work," he said. Darius Ofosu looked at the card. He recognized the name. He'd read about Massamba Capital in a textbook. He said, "Thank you," and meant it completely. Elwood Massamba went back to his room, changed out of his suit, and took a walk along the waterfront before dinner. That evening, the summit held its formal dinner in the ballroom. 14 tables, crystal glasses, a string quartet near the far wall, playing something that floated above the conversation without quite reaching it. The kind of event that feels expensive and important and is really about everyone confirming to each other that they belong there. Elwood Massamba sat at a table with Ingrid Haugen and 3 other analysts. They talked about the regulatory filing, about interest rate projections, about a hotel in Ottawa that Ingrid had stayed in during a conference 2 years ago that had remarkably good rye bread at breakfast, and that was somehow the detail everyone at the table remembered best. Jeffrey Crane was 3 tables away. Elwood Massamba noticed him once, briefly, the way you notice something that has already stopped mattering. At one point during the dessert course, Crestfield's board chair, a man named Howard Villeneuve, 70 years old, silver-haired, a former federal cabinet minister who'd moved into private equity in his late 50s, came to the table. He shook Ingrid Haugen's hand, nodded at the analysts, and then sat down briefly in the empty chair next to Elwood Massamba. "I've been meaning to introduce myself," Howard Villeneuve said. 14%. Held for 6 years. We should have been speaking long before today. You weren't asking questions, Elwood Massamba said. Neither was I, until the pivot. Villeneuve smiled. It was the smile of a man who respected that answer. The proposal will be restructured. I want to be clear that the intervention was appropriate. Frankly, it was necessary. I know, Elwood Massamba said. What would bring you to the table more regularly? We could formalize your participation in. I'll think about it, Elwood Massamba said. I'll have Claudine reach out. Villeneuve nodded. He stood, shook hands again, and moved to the next table. Ingrid Haugen watched this exchange with the careful neutrality of a person processing significant information. 14%, she said after Villeneuve had gone. Through a numbered corporation, Elwood Massamba said. Tax purposes. How long? 6 years. She picked up her wine glass. You never announced it. No reason to. She looked at him for a moment. There was a man in the lobby yesterday morning who told you to use the service entrance. Jeffrey Crane, Elwood Massamba said. Director of Strategic Partnerships. Yes, I know. The way he said it closed the subject without dismissing it. It was the tone of a man who'd filed the information exactly where it needed to go and had already moved on. What happened to Jeffrey Crane unfolded over the following 2 weeks, not in a dramatic scene, but in the quiet and remorseless way that consequences work when they move through institutions rather than through individuals. Howard Villeneuve didn't make a call. He didn't send an email. He mentioned in the course of a regular debrief with Harrington's managing partner, a woman named Suzette Forrester who had run the Toronto office for 9 years, that he'd found the lobby incident troubling. He used that word, troubling. He mentioned it once. Suzette Forrester had built her career on reading what was being said between the things being said. She thanked Villeneuve and ended the call. She then reviewed the firm's conduct records for the past 3 years. She found 4 separate incidents involving Jeffrey Crane and clients or guests of color. None of them had resulted in formal complaints. 3 of the 4 individuals had never returned to the firm. One of them, a pension fund manager from Halifax, had quietly moved $40 million in managed assets to a competitor without explanation. Suzette Forrester now understood the explanation. Jeffrey Crane was called into her office the following Monday. He came in with the confidence of a man who believed the meeting would be about something he could manage. He'd heard about the Massamba situation. He'd even been told, quietly, by a colleague he trusted, that it was probably just going to blow over. Suzette Forrester was behind her desk. She did not offer him coffee. She did not open with small talk. She slid 3 printed pages across the desk and let him read them. They were a timeline. Dates, incident descriptions, asset movement, numbers. Crane looked up. These are from years ago. Tuesday morning's incident is at the top of page 1, Forrester said. He looked, it was there. Lobby of the Fairmont Royal York. 8:52 a.m. 2 witnesses named. The name of the man he'd spoken to. I didn't know who he was, Crane said. That's precisely the problem, Forrester said. There was a pause. I'd like you to understand something, Jeffrey. Forrester's voice was level. Not cold. Not angry. Factual. The question of whether you knew who he was is not the question this firm needs to be asking. The question is why you spoke to a man that way at all. And the answer to that question is in this document. Crane had no response. His certainty had left him 2 weeks ago in a hotel lobby and had not fully returned. The outcome was not a firing. It was a restructuring. Crane's client-facing responsibilities were removed. His title changed. His access to the summit going forward was revoked. He was offered a transitional role in a back-office function and told he had 3 weeks to decide. His lawyer reviewed the terms. It was not generous, but it was fair. He signed. 2 weeks after that, Darius Ofosu was moved from his junior analyst position into a structured mentorship program that Suzette Forrester had quietly expanded, with 2 senior portfolio managers assigned to it who'd been asking for the program to grow for the past year. His name had come up in conversation with Elwood Massamba during a follow-up call between Massamba Capital and the Harrington executive team about the revised Crestfield proposal. It was a brief mention, a sentence. It was enough. Elwood Massamba never sought recognition for any of what happened. He didn't speak to the press. He didn't post about the summit. He drove back to Ottawa on the Thursday of that week, walked into his office on Elgin Street, which was larger now, 3 floors, 32 staff, the Lebanese restaurant long replaced by a dental clinic. and sat down at his desk with a mug of coffee his assistant had already poured and a stack of quarterly reports that needed his attention. His Seiko said it was 9:14 a.m. He opened the first report and started reading. 3 months later, the Crestfield proposal was revised and brought back to the board with a restructured timeline, reduced concentration risk, and a secondary market assumption that matched what Elwood Massamba's analysis had outlined. The board voted to proceed on the revised terms. The revised proposal passed 14-2. Howard Villeneuve called Elwood Massamba to inform him before the public announcement. "It's a better proposal," Villeneuve said. "Yes," Elwood Massamba said. "Would you consider joining the board formally?" I'll have Claudine reach out," Elwood Massamba said. "Thank you, Howard." He hung up. He wrote a number in the margin of the quarterly report he'd been reviewing. He drew a small circle around it. He picked up his pen, the same pen, refilled again, and kept working. Darius Ofosu called him that spring. He'd been accepted into a portfolio management track that Harrington had formalized in partnership with 2 other firms. He called to say thank you, and also, this was the part Elwood Massamba appreciated, to ask a specific question about the Rideau restructure case study. A real question about the mechanics, not the mythology. They talked for 40 minutes. Elwood Massamba answered every question directly and asked 3 of his own. When Darius hung up, he sat at his desk in the Harrington Tower on Bay Street and looked at the business card on his corkboard. Plain white. Just a name and a number. He'd looked up the firm the day after the summit. He'd read everything publicly available. He'd found the Rideau case study and read the original documents behind it. He'd gone back and found 3 other Massamba Capital transactions from the early 2000s and read those, too. He'd told his mother about the conversation in the hotel hallway. She'd asked what the man was like. "Quiet," Darius said, like everything had already been figured out. She'd nodded, the way she nodded when something confirmed what she already believed. "Those are the ones you watch," she said. "The quiet ones. They're not quiet because they have nothing to say." In Ottawa, on a Thursday morning in April, Elwood Massamba walked to work. 3 blocks from the office, past the dental clinic and the dry cleaner and the coffee shop where he'd held his first client meeting 23 years ago in a booth by the window. The spring light was thin and bright the way Ottawa spring light is, like it's apologizing for having taken so long. He had a board call at 10. A new position he was evaluating at 11, lunch at his desk. A mentorship meeting in the afternoon with a young woman from the University of Ottawa's finance program who'd sent him a cold email 6 months ago that was so well-researched and so specific that he'd forwarded it to Claudine the same day with 2 words, follow-up. He'd never stopped moving, and he'd never moved loudly. At the door of his building, he stopped, looked up at the name on the glass, Massamba Capital. The letters were the same size they'd always been, nothing dramatic. Nothing that announced itself from a distance. Just a name on a door, which is what he'd always wanted. He went inside. His assistant had poured the coffee. The quiet ones his father had told him once in the kitchen of a house in Longueuil on a Sunday afternoon when Elwood was 17 years old and furious about something he couldn't even remember now. The quiet ones are not waiting because they are afraid. They are waiting because they know how to time it right. He sat down, he picked up his pen, he started the day.